Hello! Sorry for not posting the video last week as I promised. Unfortunately, I got quite sick, so my voice might actually sound a little different. I have no idea. I recovered probably at the end of last week. But anyways, in this video, we're going to add a button. I'm going to close out of my game here, and inside the GUI, we're going to create a new class, and I'll call it button. Alright, so let's start talking about this button before we continue on with it. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about with this button is the texture. Now, currently, I have textures for a button. You can use this if you wish, and they're basically 3x3 tiles for the button, and it contains 4 edges, 4 corners, and 1 middle for each of the 3 different states. And depending how you want your button, you may not even need this last state. So the first state is the button, and it's not selected. The second state is the button with the mouse hovering over the button. And the third state, depending if you want it or not, is the mouse clicking on the button. So for our button, currently we need a position and a size. Now we could use 2 vector 2f's, but we can use our axis aligned bounding box as the button. So the first thing we want is a constructor, of course, for our button. And the first parameter that we're going to need is a vector 2f for the position and a vector 2f for the scale. All we need to do is set bounding box to, come on, and it's not responding. Oh, there we go. This dot bounding box, and we'll set this to a new bounding, or new AABB, with the center, which is the position, and the half extent, which is the scale. So now we have the bounding box of our button. That's pretty much our whole button right there. But not exactly. We're not updating anything. We're not giving it our mouse position. We're not rendering it. It's just a button sitting there in memory in one state. And speaking of states, our button only has one state. And depending if you're going to go the route of only 2 states, you could use a Boolean for if it's selected. But I'm going to take a different route. And I'm going to use an integer. And I'll call it select state. Selected state. Call it selected state. And also to have a couple of variables to indicate what is what, I'm going to create 3 static constant integers. And the first one, I'll call it state idle, and that'll be 0. The second one will be state selected, and that will be 1. And the last one will be state clicked. Okay, so state idle will be 0, state selected will be 1, and state clicked will be 2. Okay, so for our button here, let's get started rendering our button. To get started with this, we're going to create a matrix 4F here, and we'll call this transform. Alright, and then we want to set this to a new matrix 4F. Now, you could do this in the render, but that'll be very inefficient, as you're basically allocating multiple different matrix 4F objects for every frame that is being rendered. And depending how many buttons you have, that's going to get slow really fast. And might as well just make this static. Screw it, we're going with a static variable. Okay, so now let's go right ahead and create our render method here. And this method is going to have, well, it's going to want a camera, it's going to want a tile sheet, and we're also going to want a shader. So the first thing we're going to want to do is store the two variables, the position and the half extents, into a variable within this render method. So I'll create a vector2f, I'll call it position, and this will equal to bounding box get center, have a comma there, that way we can do scale, and set that equal to bounding box get half extents. Okay, so now that we have both the position and scale, we no longer have to use the bounding box. So inside this render, we no longer have to use the bounding box. So the first thing we want to render is this center tile right here. We're going to render this center tile as the background of the whole button. And then we'll render these sides over the background. So we'll set transform to identity, and we'll translate it with position.x and position.y. Keep z as 0. After we translate, we're going to want to scale. And we're going to use scale.x and scale.y. Okay, so with this line right here, the first thing we're doing is setting the identity. We're basically clearing the whole matrix and setting it to the default. Then what we're doing is we're translating it based on the position or the center variable of our bounding box, and then we're scaling it with the half extents that we get with our bounding box. This transformation right here is going to be for the background of the button. Now, we're going to leave selected state out of this for right now, and we're just going to render the non-selected state, the idle state. So we'll set the uniform in the shader of projection, and we'll use camera get projection, and then we'll multiply it with our transform. Then we'll use our tile sheet to bind the tile. We'll pass in the shader, and this is going to be at the location of 1, 1. And there we go. Next, we render. So in our assets, we have our model, and we're going to render that model, as that model is only a quad. Okay, so before we continue on with the button, we're going to go to our GUI here, and we're going to edit this a little bit. So the first thing I want to get rid of is everything in here. Everything. And everything in that render method is going to change. This is why we're getting rid of everything in there. We'll come back to this. Our new tile sheet is called GUI.png. And so far, it only contains the buttons. And this image resides in our sheets. So there's not much to change besides test to GUI. And then, because I think test is, yep, it's only 3. And because the test PNG is only 3 tiles wide, we're actually going to change this to 9 because the GUI is 9 tiles. So we'll change that to a 9, and our sheet is now prepared for the GUI. Now I'm just going to create a temporary button. I'll just call it temporary for now. And we'll set that to a new button. We'll just keep it in the center of the screen. And we'll give it 48 and 16 for the size. And all we need to do is just do temporary render with the camera, the sheet, and the shader. So now when we run, we should only have, oh, I closed out the image. We should only have that gray tile. Or we have the whole tile sheet render. It'd be a smart idea if I bind the shader Okay. I'll change that back to what it was before. And now it should be a gray background. So I'm actually going to double the size. Alright, so here's our button. It's not a good looking button, but it's a button. So now we have to render the sides. And we're going to want to render the sides before we render the corners. So let's get started with the first side. I'm going to comment this and call it middle, or fill, whichever you want to call it. Let's get started with the sides of the button. We're going to render the sides first, and then we'll get to the corners. And I'm actually going to separate this into two different methods. They're both going to be private, and they're going to want the same variables be passed to it. And this is just to add some sort of organization to the code. We'll render the sides. And then we'll render the corners. Alright, and we'll need actually two more values. I'll add them in the beginning, and they're going to be the position and scale. That's going to be very important. Type correctly. Okay. So now I'm just going to copy and paste what we have rendering the center of the button, and I'm going to paste the first one in here. And I'm going to render the top first. So let's start off with the translate. We're going to do position.y, and we're going to add the scale y and subtract 16. And then we're going to change the scale y right here to 16. So now this is going to position the button to the top of the button. And we subtract 16 because we're scaling by 32. The scale is actually half of what it would really be. It'd be better if we actually rendered the right tile. So far, that is correct. And to see if it actually is correct, let's change the size of the button from 96 to 32. There we go. Now we know that the edge of the button does align up correctly to the actual edge of the button. So back in the button, I'm going to copy this and paste it. this is going to be the bottom side of the button. And the modifications here is instead of it adding scale Y, we're going to subtract it. And instead of subtracting 16, we're going to add 16. And then we're going to change the tile to its correct tile. So let's take a look. 1, 0, that's the top, and then 1, 2. That's going to be right here. So now let's go ahead and run and see if it works. Just like it should. All that's left is to do the other sides, left and right. So I'm going to copy and paste it again, and the first one is going to be left, and the second is going to be right. So go ahead and get rid of the plus and minus scale Y and 16, and go ahead and replace these 16s right here with scale Y. We're actually going to replace scale X with 16 instead. So now, with the left, we're going to edit the translation. And we're actually going to subtract scale X and add 16. Then for the right side, we're going to add scale X and subtract 16. And of course, we're going to need the right textures. So, before we go on with the right textures, right here, we basically just swapped the Y and X value of the translation pretty much. We changed the X scale to fit appropriately with how the edge should be scaled. We've also translated along the X instead of the Y. This is translating it to the left, which is the left side, and this is going to translate it correctly towards the right side. So 0, 1, and 2, 1. Okay, so that's our button. And okay, it's sort of correct. But the problem here is that we're not rendering the corners. This is why we have corner textures. So let's go ahead and render the corners. I am going to copy the fill, and let's get rendering the corners. So I want to render the top left first. So we're going to change the scales, both X and Y, to 16. This is going to scale, of course, our corner correctly, the way we want it, so that way it's not stretched, it's not skewed, it's not all that other crap, it's perfect. And then we're going to want to translate the X. So we're going to translate it to the left using the same value as our left here. And then for the Y, we're going to want to translate it upwards. So at this top, I'm going to copy this scaling here in the translation and just paste it here. And there we go. The translation and scaling is correct. All we got to do is change the tile to match what it is on the sheet. And look at that. We have the corner to our button. And so it should pretty much be the same going for the others. We'll go with top right this time. The Y translation will be the same, but the X translation will just be plus scale X and minus 16. And of course, we'll change the tile to fit in our tile sheet. Let's go ahead and run. And we got the top portion of our button looking perfect. Now we got to get the bottom. So the bottom should be really simple. Just copy and paste these two. I'm going to comment these to bottom left and bottom right. And we don't need to touch the X translation. However, the Y translation is going to be different, and it's going to be the same for both of them. It's going to be minus scale plus 16. Same with down here, minus scale Y and plus 16. And then for the tile, we'll just put 2 for the Y. And now we have a full button. And this concludes part 1.